music and everything. And I'm going to let them take it away. I'm not a part of this.
That's a good place to stop it, isn't it? I usually, in post, I'll fade. I won't. That's the ongoing joke of everything I say I'll do in post. I just never do and leave it. I just leave that in the podcast so that people can imagine that I did it. And I think it's better. Are you going to fall and die, Ryan?
It just tilts. I think we'll do. I'm fine. I'm not going anywhere, right?
Well, we got you.
We want you to feel type safe.
Yeah.
This is not very safe.
They actually give you that chair just so they can make that joke.
It was a great joke, wasn't it? It really, really worked. Yeah, so why don't you...
We're TalkScript, and I am Nick Nisi. I'm a TypeScript developer at SitePen and a panelist on the TalkScript podcast.
That's true. And I am Torrey Rice. I had to check my card for that just to make sure I wrote it right, because that's important. I'm a co-founder and the chief creative officer at SitePen, which is the only thing I actually had to check the card for because we're so big on titles that I had to ask someone what it was to make sure I got it right. So this is a guy named Anders Hejlsberg.
Yeah, that's it, actually.
I got it. I nailed it, right? Thank you. I nailed it. You just lean into it. Lean into it. He likes to compile things, I've heard. He is a guy who works at Microsoft. He is a technical fellow, does a TypeScript thing, and has done C#, Delphi, and Turbo Pascal. This is Ryan Cavanaugh, who is actually not the banjo playing Ryan Cavanaugh. Well, I mean, he plays a banjo, but I put on the slide that you don't, and now it's kind of awkward.
It's confusing, right?
It's confusing because I was really excited when we booked you, and now the banjo behind the stage, useless.
Yeah.
Absolutely useless. He's been working on TypeScript since its first public release and recently became the engineering lead for the compiler. So that is good for you, buddy. Proud of you. And then we have Daniel Rosenwasser.
Perfect.
Yes. Daniel is the program manager on the TypeScript language at Microsoft, and he has spent about half his time on the team as both an engineer and as a program manager, and has a long-standing passion for programming languages, type systems, and compilers, and giving Ryan crap about banjos. That is accurate. So, oh yeah, I forgot to introduce the podcast portion of this. So we are, as far as I know, the first and only podcast to be confusingly named to make you think that you're saying TypeScript, but it's TalkScript, just so that we're very clear on what we're talking about.
I have to check myself every time.
Every time, and I actually have gotten it wrong way too many times already. So it is, I think I nailed it with the confusing name for this podcast, which actually just used to be called the SitePen podcast, but it was like really, no one knows what that is. So I think we nailed it with this one. So anyway, that's who everyone up here is, and that was exciting, I'm sure. So now let's just get into the real meat of everything and start asking you guys questions. The first question is, how has it been seeing TypeScript take off? And are there specific things that you would attribute to TypeScript success and high adoption?
I think, I think first of all, the fact that we did it open source, I think made a huge difference. We would have gone nowhere with a closed source language. And in fact, my bold prediction is there will be no successful closed source programming languages ever after, I think. I think that's pretty much already borne out by reality.
So home edition and professional edition are not going to happen?
No, yeah. Enterprise edition, yes.
Never say never.
This card.
So that's one thing. I think the other thing is TypeScript actually builds on the world's largest community of programmers, and we found a way to actually, instead of starting something brand new, to leverage something that was there, if you will. Not leverage, but I mean, there was obviously our intent was to make it better, right? And so in that sense, TypeScript is different also from other languages in that it's not really a new language, it's an improvement of an existing language, right? So I think those two, and then the community, you know, the fact that we have this strong community, and we've all, I mean, I don't think there was a talk that didn't talk about definitely type today, right? I mean, it is amazing what this community does, and the sort of virtuous cycle that just keeps getting stronger and stronger.
Sounds right to me, and I think that there's just so many things that you can kind of point to that all sort of culminated in this, right? Like, I think just different members of the team, as they, you know, have previously been part of the team or are currently, all bring something really great that they're passionate about and can improve the product. And so, like, if your passion is community or something like that, like, we've had people who are really into that, talking on the issue tracker, and, like, you know, growing things out, not just from the technological perspective, because I think, like, we on the team, we're proud of the things that we build, but it can't just be that. It is part of the community, it's growing the community, is making sure that we meet developers where they are. And that's always been a core thing, where we're not trying to push the community in a different direction. We're trying to, like, serve something for everybody. So I think that's a big part of it.
I would just add, like, starting with JavaScript was obviously the best decision, and having all the code on Stack Overflow be still something you can paste into your program, absolutely critical. All the JavaScript answers still good. You're still good to go there.
Kind of came with a built-in community like that.
Yeah. Right.
We recently heard optional chaining made it to stage 3, as we've definitely heard today. And the TypeScript team was involved in championing that proposal. What inspired you all to work on that?
This one's for Daniel.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I think, so as Anders said this morning, optional chaining is issue number 16, and we had to close it at some point because the conversation wasn't actually getting productive. It's like, we want this thing, and we're like, we know, it's okay. And, you know, so, you know, I'd been going to a couple of TC39 meetings. I'd been somewhat involved. But, you know, until that point, it was more of a, I think, a thing where we were just trying to, like, you know, hope things progressed and find a way to focus on the type system based on, like, what was getting standardized. But we really kind of felt like, you know, if this is the thing that our community wants the most, like, we should actually work on it. And so every single time, you know, there'd be, you know, I'd go to the meetings, and Anders would kind of say, like, okay, but, like, why are they, you know, what's the progress on optional chaining? And I'm like, it didn't get discussed at this one. And so it kept coming up, and at some point, the proposal had an opening for a new champion. The prior two authors, while they did really great work, just weren't able to work on it anymore, and so I just commented on the repo. I said, like, hey, is this thing up for grabs?
Was there a duel or anything you had to do to become the champion?
Dueling banter?
Dueling banter.
There was a fight. It got a little bloody.
Okay.
No, there was actually a couple of co-champions that actually helped me out. This is the first feature I worked on, but you know, over the next couple of months, within, like, I think 2 meetings, we were able to get it to stage 3. And I think that focus and that kind of, like, setting a certain goal for when we wanted to get in there was a key thing, and just making sure that we could build consensus, because that was the harder part of it, because, you know, just getting everybody on board and getting an idea of what people are willing to kind of give up on, or what people are really, really tied down to.
That sounds like a unique challenge in this case. I think developers usually just concede and move on to the other person. So
You should go to the TC39 committee sometime.
There's a lot of people with really strong opinions, and so in some cases, you know, you have to figure out, like, what do most people not care about, and then like, what are table stakes, right? You know, what are people looking for in the UX, and what is and you look for that as the core thing you're trying to deliver.
I think the it's a real success story in terms of like waiting, and like good things are worth waiting for, and optional chaining is really, really good. And I'm glad that we went through the proper process and put it through TC39, because I think ultimately the decisions that the committee ended up with were not probably the decisions we would have guessed at. And as we've seen with class fields, it's a bit of a sticky situation if you guess at what the semantics for something should be and then the committee decides differently. So I'm really happy that we are not dealing with some huge weird breaking change problem because we tried to ship the feature too early.
Yeah, it's really a testament to your goal of just being a superset of JavaScript and not trying to change that, because you had a lot of pressure to just add that in, but you didn't, and so that's a real testament.
Yeah, it's not the IE 6 days, that's for sure. Wrong venue for that. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Microsoft. So, sponsors. So, what do you think are the biggest challenges for TypeScript in the near future, and then from that in the kind of long term?
I think we're seeing really big code bases getting written, and I think Daniel he's getting me into meetings like every single day now with various people around the industry who have code bases that are bigger than we ever imagined anyone would write in JavaScript, let alone TypeScript. And figuring out how we scale up the product to those larger code bases is something that we're spending a lot of time on, and trying to figure out what developers can do on their side and what we can do on on our side to make things faster. And it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I'd add to that you know, our type checker and our compiler has gotten a lot larger than it was in the beginning. And part of the problem with JavaScript is, like, every time you add lines of code, everything runs a little bit slower, just because there's just more stuff for the JIT to do. There's more locality of reference misses in the caches because the code that the VM generates is bigger, and so every feature we add, even if it in a sense doesn't affect anything in theory, it just makes it go a little slower, and we can sort of see it just like keeps, and it's like it irks us, you know, because we want to do new features, but they make the product bigger and then it goes slower. And then of course the features themselves I mean, the more type checks we do, the longer it takes to do them, right? And so that's a challenge too. So there's this fine balance. We're always trying to find like ways to make it run faster. I am actually still to this day flabbergasted that it's possible at all to write compilers of this complexity in JavaScript and run them with darn decent performance. I mean, I would have forsworn. That's just, yeah, I still don't believe it. It's kind of.
You took a pretty big
still
gamble
like
then,
living
didn't you?
this dream.
Can't believe we got away with it, Andy.
This could have
I'm gonna wake up someday and go.
This could have gone
"Oh,
south
thank
for
God
you,
it's
couldn't
not
it?
yet."
It's like the first time you did something and it just didn't work out, and they'd be like, well, you know, look, I had a pretty good run. So, can't all be winners.
I think, you know, performance is probably the near-term thing that we're thinking about, right? And it will be the long-term one as well, right? We're always trying to make sure that you have a instant responsiveness in the editor, as well as low compile times, right? I think another long-term thing that, you know, I think we've been thinking about, and you've heard a lot of it today, is just UX, right? So, you know, last time we were at TSConf, we talked about this a bit. This year, you know, it's still ongoing, and you know, I hear other things like, you know, for example, we're making platforms for kids to program in TypeScript or TypeScript variants, and you know, when I speak to people at Microsoft, they're, you know, creating environments for people who are not programmers at all, but to write, you know, things like macros in JavaScript for Office, right, and TypeScript. And so, how do we provide something that is understandable as a language and also give people a good experience there, even if they don't consider themselves programmers? Because on one hand, like, this is a space that was generally dominated by VB and VB script and all that stuff. And JavaScript was also kind of like this, you know, very beginner-friendly language. And so for a lot of people, TypeScript seems intimidating, but I think it would be a really great thing if we could get rid of that barrier to entry and make people feel welcome and understand what's going wrong when they get these errors. So UX.
Speaking of performance, what's something that you would implement if there was no performance hit at all that is impossible right now because of performance issues?
Oh, I mean, there are so many things. I mean, it's we could do way more in control flow analysis than we do now. You know, we don't like analyze. We don't try to inline calls and see what are the effects of this call, and you know, which, I mean, you could start speculating about that. It's really bottomless at that point. You know, it's so that would just be one, I think.
Yeah, like union call resolution on unions.
Yeah,
like,
yeah, that'd be another one. Yep. I mean, the real way to figure out, you know, when you're calling something through a union type, really, and we sort of know this already, is you really ought to try the call for every constituent in the union and do the full resolution of all of that, and then union together the results of that, right? But that means that now, if you have a union with 100 members, then all of a sudden, every time you make a call, it's actually 100 times as much work for the type checker, right? And that's like, probably don't want that.
And then everyone starts asking about WebAssembly because it's just obviously going to make your head explode. Any other things that?
Probably that, but if not that, there's you know, when we first did control flow analysis, we had to pick a design of like, should you be more conservative in your analysis of like, you know, whether or not an assignment changes the type, whether or not a function call can change the type of a variable locally, or do you pessimistically assume that, well, you have to decide whether or not something changes the type locally if you make a function call. And we generally assume that your functions are not trying to sabotage you as you use them. Right. But then we still get bug reports saying, well, why does this happen? And so we point people to like an issue number we've memorized, which is 9998. Yeah. And so
the answer to everything.
Yeah. Which is weird. I mean, it's weird, but like, you know, if you could imagine if there was some form of data flow analysis that could be done on the fly, but I don't really know what that would look like or be.
It'd be so weird because you'd have to put it into a DTS file, and it's like your DTS would be like declare function f modifies 25 different properties it might modify sometimes.
An effect system. Yeah, we want an effect system.
Yeah.
Okay. So it feels like with every major version of TypeScript, there's been kind of an underlying theme that pushes things forward, a focus or a vision. So with 3.9, very close, I assume. What does a focus look like for 4.0 or beyond?
Do you know, Daniel?
They have no plan. We've just caught them.
Busted.
Engineers, like, I don't plan ahead. What do you? We're just in time.
We're just going to rebrand 3.7 to 4.0 before it gets released.
I think, you know, honestly, I don't think the themes are going to change all that much. I think overarching, it is one of the things that we continuously try to do is listen to the community, and whatever is important to the community, whatever gets upvoted, this is something that we're going to pay attention to. There's tracking what the ECMAScript committee does. That's also something that's important. Daniel mentioned user experience. That's important to us. We continue to speculate about, you know, like the world is clearly pivoting slowly, but towards more functional styles of programming, right? And there are a whole bunch of paradigms there that we've done a bunch of work to capture, but there's way more that still could be done about reasoning deeper about immutability and read-onliness and whatever. There are some hard problems to solve there with like strict read-only, you know, that we continue to contemplate. We don't necessarily know the answers. At least we don't know answers that don't break the world, and we try to not break the world. So, but those are some of the things that go around in our heads. Yeah.
I think until we get closer to solutions, it's hard to tell if we're like actually near them or not. It's like I feel it's like you're out sailing, and if you can't see any land, you're not sure how far out you are. But then once you see the island, you can like kind of just go straight to it. But I think on like the immutability front, where there's no land nearby that is something you'd want to go to.
Not yet, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, features may appear closer than they are. In
Yeah.
some cases.
Just don't get drunk and decide you're going to swim across the lake towards those features, because I don't think you'll make it.
Well, and that's the thing to keep in mind, right? Like sometimes something seems like, oh, well, we would love to do this, but it's not possible, and so we kind of like put it aside. And then sometimes, a couple of features later, we realize that we've built up the right building blocks, the right primitives to express those things better.
Yeah, like circular type references, we were like, oh, it's impossible, because we, like, when we first had them, it couldn't be done. And then we built machinery and more stuff. And then we took another look and we're like, oh, it's like not quite a hop, skip, and a jump, but a lot more possible than it used to be.
Yeah.
And I think like the uncalled function checks that we put in, someone had logged a bug, something like that, and I was like, oh, we'll just check for like definitely truthy things, and it turns out that this is a terrible idea. You get so many false positives. So it's like even things that seem in your head like a really easy shoe-in kind of feature, you have to iterate on and figure out what you're going to break, and you keep scoping down these rules until they actually work.
So with issue 16, we've saw examples of the community pressuring diverging from JavaScript. Has anything coming to the language, like in proposals, ever made you feel like you want to diverge from JavaScript?
No.
Good answer.
Yeah, I mean, we started out in the very early days of TypeScript. We did sort of stray into extending parts of the language that aren't just type annotations. Things like namespaces, enums, but at the time there were no modules, and that was sort of our best guess at what we could do, at least without a loader, and people wanted classes, but there were no classes, so we had to sort of take a guess at what classes were going to look like. But then once they did appear in JavaScript, we aligned on that. And I think, once ECMAScript 6 happened, I mean, there was so much that went in there, and then the committee is like, there are plenty of features going into the language already, and the last thing we want to do is try to like do our own thing. I think we would, not only would it go straight against, I think our #1 design principle, right? And second, it would alienate the community, and it would, that's just not at all.
Do you feel like it's the lesson you learned back from the Java days?
Hmm?
Do you feel like it's the lesson you learned from back in the Java days?
No, I think, the way we operate now, it's the right way to operate. So, and we're going to continue to stick to that.
Yeah, I think if you listen to the recording of the panel from last time, it was like, what are your big mistakes in TypeScript? And they're all the features that diverged from ECMAScript. And try not to make the same mistakes twice.
Yeah.
Something I always forget is TypeScript existed pretty well before ES6. And
Oh, well before.
Yeah. And none of that existed. We just take it for granted now.
Right.
I had if you go back to when TypeScript first came out, it's strange to think about how different the world was in 2012. 1 in 3 Americans had a smartphone. Does anyone here not have a smartphone? The top web framework was jQuery. Who's using jQuery? My #1 thing. It's just a very, very different world. And I think people look at the world through Modernize and say, hey, why don't you guys just use Babel for translation the whole time? And we're like, because we would have had to wait 3 more years.
Yeah, I actually went back because one thing I was going to do was bring up just a random issue number because you have always memorized. And I decided not to do that, but I looked at issue #1, and it was actually one of our employees responding to something on there. And I remember when he brought TypeScript to us, he's like, oh, I think we should adopt this, and this should be something that we do. And I was like, a Microsoft solution to a JavaScript thing? Where have you been for the last 20 years? Does this seem like a good idea? This seems like a really bad idea.
The caution is understandable.
And, I was won over, obviously, but at first it was the craziest sounding thing that now you're just like, it's a whole different world. But at the time, it was insanity to be like, I don't think this is not a good idea. don't think it's going to work out well. I was wrong, like a lot of things. Okay, so now we're going to pivot to a segment that I am calling Asked and Anders.
Are you confused?
I'll go with it.
This might not, I don't know, this might not be the right card. I'll try to make this work. This is a really not the right card. Anyway, all right, so let me see how I can pivot this. So there's a divide in our communities, and we even see it online. Vocal minorities are loudly proclaiming their position as being the correct position, and it can be frustrating when it leads from online back into the real world. We all know the examples of that. So if you were king for a day, how would you deal with the JS developers that insist on omitting semicolons? And is capital punishment too harsh? Did I pivot that one well enough? Okay.
It's an interesting pivot. Yeah, I was never a fan of automatic semicolon insertion, if that's what you're asking.
That's where I got there eventually.
And honestly, I mean, I think it is very easy to demonstrate why it's a bad idea. I mean, if you say return and you have some long object literal that you're returning, and let me put it on a new line, and now the function returns nothing, and there's an object literal that is unreachable code, right? And it's like, well, I sure didn't expect that, so making semicolons optional in a language where they actually have grammatical meaning, is not a good idea.
So capital punishment is something.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean,
you're very
got to show
skilled.
leniency, but
Okay,
but some form of incarceration.
I'm an American, so I get it. They're from a much nicer
I would just dive in and say in 3.7, semicolons on your auto imports are now configurable. So if you are a semicolon-free person, we got your back, even if JavaScript doesn't.
I think that my idea of running them out of town with pitchforks was rejected. That was issue 666. Okay, so throughout your entire career, I think that one thing that is, I was really watching interviews from you 25 years ago, and which, by the way, there's a great interview called Behind the Code, and it's available on the Microsoft, like, what's that? Channel 9, but you have to have Silverlight to play it. So
why didn't you trust
the good old
Microsoft in
days.
2012?
after I tried to find a computer that could run it, because mine couldn't, I then did a search and found it on YouTube. So I don't know what that's all about, but Google has your video and your own. I just bringing that up for no reason. But I think one of the things that I've seen, like from my interpretation of kind of, you see problems with the UX of languages, and you say, not only could this be better, I think I'm gonna try it out and make sure. Like, I'm just gonna see, right? Just like you wouldn't believe that TypeScript, you said earlier, that you could do all this with that. And it kind of feels like even just starting with Turbo Pascal and doing that and just trying to, like, I could make this faster, right? That it takes a certain type. Like, I think that there's kind of like, there's developers and there's architects, and to me, like, you can be both, and then maybe someone's a very good architect, but like getting down and dirty into the code is not like their thing. So I think that, I guess my question is, like, what to you makes someone a great architect when you look at kind of throughout your career and how you've architected these things?
I've always found that that the people who do truly great at programming tend to be the ones that care a lot about the details, but they also know how to connect it to the big picture. You often get people who are visionaries, and they can paint out visions, but they can't lay down the long path of incremental steps that will ultimately get you to the vision. Do you know what I mean? And so it's not enough to have a brilliant idea. You also have to understand how you get from nothing to the ultimate implementation of that idea in attainable steps along the way, right? Where you, okay, now we're going to make this better, then we're going to make that better. And you got to care about the details along the way so you don't lose people as they go on this journey with you, right? And so I've always been a big believer too in dog fooding whatever you build, which is why TypeScript is built in TypeScript and C#'s compiler is built in C#. Because there's nothing like feeling on your own body and your own programming experience how this is horrible and we got to do something about it, right? And what is the something we got to do? And that motivates you to think about it. So
I would never.
So whenever I see a compiler for one language that's written in another language, I sort of know that, okay, they just made that a lot harder for themselves. And it's going to be harder for them to get to a place that we can go to quicker.
Okay.
Those are a couple of things, I think.
All right, so that was asked and Anders. Thank you for that. We are going to now move on to the community questions. So I will start that off. So Thomas K. from Vienna said, I would like to contribute to the compiler, but the code base is pretty big and there's almost no documentation besides the code itself. Whom or where can I ask if I have questions about the internals and why is it all Daniel's fault? Actually, I accidentally wrote that last part.
It's still true.
It is.
I don't.
I was going to say, so first off, I think that we try to leave a couple of issues that are what we label as good first issues. So those are always good ways of getting an idea of the compiler itself. You know, you can obviously like read like a classical textbook on a compiler, but in general, like that's not the barrier to entry that we are trying to set up for people. And we like to think it's a little more approachable than that. So there's, you know, those good first issues, and we are generally pretty responsive about telling people like where you should look and what you should do to try to tackle things. There are a couple of pages on the wiki, like architectural overviews, that give you an idea of like how the compiler and the language service are architected. So like what the layering is, things like that. And we also have some new team members as well who have been actually trying to find ways to, like, as they are getting acclimated to the code base, documenting these things and saying, oh, this is actually kind of tough. Like, how can I write this down so that a new team member can learn this stuff, as well as, you know, how can the community benefit from this as well?
Mm-hmm. I think if you're trying to add features to the compiler, find a pull request for a similar feature. Like that's what I do, honestly. Yeah. Like if you're adding a new new keyword, you know, the pull requests we have, they don't have like extraneous stuff in them. So you can go see like, oh, you add a keyword here, you add an enum value here, you add a case in the parser here, so on and so forth. Hopefully look at the test cases, see what's going on. The other thing I would say is, Anders correctly asked people to not ask questions on the issue tracker. If it's about the compiler itself and you want to know like, what the heck is this thing doing in this function here, I'm pretty happy to answer those. I just don't want like, why doesn't my app fetch this data from this server? I'm like, I don't know either.
Or why haven't you answered my other question that I submitted earlier?
Right. I think too, one interesting, I think maybe it was Nathan who suggested or observed that, boy, the compiler actually used to be a lot smaller. TypeScript 1.1 or 1.2 was, I don't even know
it's
how much.
Checker.ts is like 8,000 lines.
Yeah, now it's almost 40,000.
Number we're not going to say.
But all of the principles are the same. There are lots of things that aren't there, like there are no union types and there's no control flow analyzer and whatever. But you know, there's still, you know, like the scanner, the lexer, the parser, the binder, the checker and the emitter, and you can sort of get an idea of how it's all layered and how the language service works on top of it and so forth. So if you want to look at a smaller code base that does the same thing, then actually just look at the old source code from 5 years ago, and then you know, you'll discover that it's all still there. There's just more there, but it makes it maybe easier to see the forest for the trees that way.
I like that. All right, our next question comes from Tizian C from Romania, and it is, what is the state of negated types? Are they still planned for the future?
Negated types.
So I would say I think it's pretty well understood in terms of like the mechanics, in terms of like what it would mean. But I think the real sticking point, at least for me, is like how does that relate to control flow? Because it would be very bad if you said like you take in some string, you compare it to some value, and then if it wasn't that value, you return it. Like you probably don't want the return type of that function to be like not s and not quote quote or something. Or maybe you do, maybe you don't. It depends on like what the string is. But then you get into you start thinking about it more. It's like, well, okay, maybe that means that a simple comparison doesn't introduce the negation of the type. Well, now the feature is like almost useless because you take some string, you compare it against the empty string, and then you call some function that says, I don't take empty strings, and now you have an error. And it's like, well, is the type of this expression, does it include the negations from its control flow, or doesn't it? Because you only have one answer, right? And the return type of the function, we talked about this with conditional types, where it's like relating the control flow graph to make a conditional type. Well, you don't want the inferred return type to a function to be a restatement of the function's implementation except in the type system, where it's like every single branch in your function body turns into some weird conditional type or negated type in your return type. That's bad too. So it's really like, how do we square that circle? I think the features like the use cases are like pretty compelling, but there's also a lot of like really good workarounds. Depending on what you want to accomplish.
This is one where we're gonna be careful because we find too that whenever we introduce new type constructors in the language, and negated types are yet another type constructor, and we have things like unions and intersections and index access types and whatever. For every new type constructor, there's just a never-ending long tail of strange combinations with other type constructors in higher order form that we had neglected to reason about because all of your examples tend to be sort of zero order, simple, but really we have to work it all out in higher order form. We have to understand what does it mean when you take a T and not U, and is that assignable to which ones, and what about if you intersect that with and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are definitely interesting things that negated types do that are really beautiful, whatever, but they are also, in a sense, antimatter when you're reasoning about the types, and they are in many ways very unintuitive, and I think people find them not easy to reason about. So there's sort of some natural warnings there as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about types as sets, as we often do, and like unions,
right?
These are donuts. They create holes in this thing, and you can no longer say
opposite topography. Yeah, they're carve-outs. So it's infinity except for these four.
Now put that through a mapped type. What happens?
Exactly. What does that mean?
Well, I think that's about all the time we have, unfortunately, for questions because we are out of time. So I wanted to thank the panel here, Anders and Daniel and Ryan, not the Banjo Ryan. Thank you guys so much, and I'm going to hand it over to Nick now to give you guys, I'm going to leave, and we're going to go this way, and you can, let's give a round of applause for our panel.
All right, thank you. Thank you.